The end of the beginning. Why formal Reconstruction ended with work left to do. With all of the changes that were being made to the culture of the South in the years after the Civil War, it was perhaps inevitable that the whites who lived there were going to react negatively to it. Many whites were surprised that African Americans could learn to read and write and participate in society. But that surprise did not mean that they were ready for African American equality. In 1865, some former Confederate soldiers got together and formed the Ku Klux Klan, or the KKK. The purpose of the KKK was to terrorize African Americans into not taking advantage of the rights that they had been granted by the 14th and 15th Amendment. Carpetbaggers and scalawags were also targets of the KKK, as they were supposed to be helping African Americans in the South. Members of the KKK wore white robes and hoods as a way to try and hide their identity, as they planted burning crosses on the lawns of their victims, or dragged their victims from their homes, harassing, torturing, kidnapping, or even murdering them. The radical Republicans had already sent the military into the South to keep order and to try and guarantee African American equality with the Reconstruction Act of 1867. When the military proved ineffective at preventing the KKK from performing their acts of terror, the radical Republicans decided to pass another law to try and prevent this from happening. The Enforcement Act of 1870 banned the use of terror, force, or bribery to prevent people from voting because of their race. This act, along with the troops, did have some success in preventing the KKK from being truly effective. But as time went on, and those same troops were stretched further and further throughout the military district they were responsible for, their ability to prevent other acts of terror proved very difficult. By the middle of the 1870s, people across the country were growing tired of the Reconstruction efforts of the radical Republicans. It was becoming obvious to all that despite all of the laws that had been passed and the amendments that had been added to the Constitution, very little was going to change for African Americans in the South. The 13th Amendment had ended slavery, but sharecropping became the economic reality of the South. The 14th Amendment had provided legal equality, but segregation was soon to be the law of the land, which would create an atmosphere of separate but equal. The 15th Amendment had provided political equality, but the KKK had worked to terrorize African Americans into not voting, along with other laws that Southern states put in place to prevent African Americans from voting. When the presidential election of 1876 rolled around, the outcome was certainly in doubt because of people's hesitancy at giving the Republicans 4 more years to keep trying to bring about equality. The Republicans nominated Rutherford B. Hayes of Ohio against the Democrat nominee Samuel Tilden of New York. When the initial votes were counted, it appeared that Tilden had won, but there was some argument about which electoral votes should be counted in some southern states. 2 sets of electoral votes arrived from the Republican-controlled states of Louisiana, Florida, and South Carolina. The Republicans argued that the votes claiming Hayes to be the winner should be counted because African Americans were scared off or prevented from voting in those states. The Democrats were not happy with this option, and some began to argue that this dispute could be the start of another civil war. In an effort to prevent that from happening, both sides agreed to a 15-person committee to examine the results and decide which votes would be counted. There were 5 Republicans, 5 Democrats, and 5 members of the supposedly impartial Supreme Court, 3 of which were Republicans, 2 of which were Democrats. After examining the evidence, the committee voted 8-7, right along party lines, that the Republican votes should be counted. Democrats were furious at this result, believing that another election had been stolen from them. Finally, both sides agreed to the Compromise of 1877, which said that Hayes, the Republican, would be president, and that the first thing he would do as president would be to remove the U.S. troops from the South. This brought about a formal end to Reconstruction, but it did not mean that the work of putting the country back together again was finished. In fact, it was really now just beginning.